A small-town grocery store became the center of national attention when a store manager humiliated a disabled man in front of stunned shoppers. But when Shaquille O'Neal unexpectedly intervenes and brings the local news into the mix, everything changes. Will this moment ignite lasting change, or will it be forgotten as just another viral story? Stay tuned to find out, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge perspectives. It was just another weekday afternoon at Wilson's Market, a cornerstone of the small town of Maplewood. The store had been around for decades, known for its quaint atmosphere and friendly staff, or at least that's what the sign out front promised. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as shoppers moved leisurely through the aisles, carts rattling over uneven tiles. James Carter, a man in his late 40s, walked carefully down the canned goods aisle. His left leg dragged slightly as he leaned on his forearm crutches, his movements deliberate and practiced. James had been a regular at Wilson's for years, ever since his injury during a construction accident left him partially disabled. Though the townspeople were used to seeing him around, James never quite got used to the occasional stares or whispered comments. He had learned to ignore them mostly, but today was different. As James reached for a can of soup on the top shelf, he felt the gaze of someone watching him. He glanced over his shoulder to find Rick, the store manager, standing near the end of the aisle with his arms crossed. Rick, a stocky man with a perpetually furrowed brow, was known for running the store with an iron fist. "Hey, you," Rick's voice echoed across the aisle, halting James mid-reach. James turned slowly, confused. "Me?" "Yeah, you. Don't you think you're taking a little too long there? We've got other customers waiting," Rick snapped, loud enough for nearby shoppers to stop and look. James frowned, glancing around. The aisle was nearly empty. "I'm just getting my groceries," he said, his voice steady but low. Rick stepped closer, his presence looming. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but people like you," he gestured vaguely at James's crutches, "should maybe shop during slower hours. It's hard for you to keep up, and it's hard for us to keep things moving." The words hit like a punch to the gut. James froze, his hand still hovering near the soup can. He felt a hot flush rise to his face as humiliation set in. He could see other shoppers watching now, their curiosity turning into murmured disapproval. "That's uncalled for," a woman nearby muttered under her breath. James forced himself to stay calm. "I have every right to shop here like anyone else," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. Rick shrugged, undeterred. "I'm just saying, it's common courtesy. You're slowing things down for everyone else." The air grew heavy with tension. A few people whispered among themselves while others avoided looking altogether. James lowered his eyes, not wanting to cause a bigger scene, but the shame was unbearable. Suddenly, a deep voice boomed from behind Rick. "Excuse me, what's the problem here?" All eyes turned to Shaquille O'Neal, larger than life and unmistakable, stepped into the aisle. His towering frame filled the narrow space, and the expression on his face was a mix of calm authority and simmering outrage. Rick blinked, caught off guard. Mr. O'Neal, I didn't realize you were." Shaq raised a hand, silencing him. "This man," he said, pointing to James, "is just trying to live his life. What gives you the right to talk to him like that?" Rick stammered, his confidence draining as quickly as it had flared. "I was just—" "No," Shaq interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "You don't treat people like this. Not here, not anywhere." The silence that followed was deafening. Shoppers watched in stunned silence as the moment unfolded, the weight of Shaq's words cutting through the tension like a knife. James, still gripping his crutch, looked up at Shaq with wide eyes. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel small. The air inside Wilson's Market was thick with tension as shoppers watched Shaquille O'Neal confront Rick, the store manager. Rick's bravado had all but disappeared, replaced with a nervous energy as the basketball legend stared him down. James Carter stood in silence, his grip tightening on his crutch. The humiliation he had felt just moments ago was now mixed with a strange sense of vindication. Yet he couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. Years of being overlooked and dismissed didn't disappear so easily. Shaq turned slightly to address the crowd that had gathered, his voice carrying effortlessly through the store. "Let me tell you something," he said, his tone even but commanding. "I grew up watching my mom work hard every day. She taught me to treat people with respect no matter who they are or what they're going through. What just happened here? That's not respect. That's not right. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman near the produce section nodded in agreement, while a young father holding his toddler whispered something to his wife. Rick's face reddened, but he tried to regain control of the situation. "Look, Mr. O'Neill," Rick began, his voice shaky. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. I was just pointing out that what Shaq interrupted, his eyebrow arched. That someone with a disability should shop at a different time. That they're an inconvenience to you? Let me tell you something else. Your job is to run this store, not judge people who walk through the door." The crowd began to shift, their attention now divided between Shaq and Rick. Someone pulled out their phone and started recording. James noticed the red light of the camera blinking, and a wave of unease washed over him. He didn't want to be at the center of a viral moment, but it was clear this encounter was no longer just about him. Rick cleared his throat, his words coming out clipped. "I didn't mean anything by it. I'm just trying to manage my store efficiently." "You manage efficiently by treating people fairly," Shaq shot back. He turned to James, his voice softening. "What's your name, man?" "James," he said quietly, the spotlight making him feel smaller than ever. Shaq nodded. "James, you don't owe this man or anyone else an apology for being here. You belong wherever you want to be. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." A smattering of applause broke out among the shoppers, but James still felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He managed a small nod of thanks, his voice catching in his throat. Before Rick could say anything else, the sliding doors at the front of the store whooshed open, and a young woman with a camera crew rushed in. "Local news channel 8, she announced, scanning the crowd. "We got a tip about an incident happening here involving Shaquille O'Neal." Rick's eyes widened. "Oh, come on," he muttered under his breath, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. The reporter wasted no time, angling her microphone toward Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill, can you tell us what's going on here?" Shaq gave Rick one last pointed look before addressing the reporter. "What's going on," he said, "is a lesson in basic human decency. I stepped in because I couldn't stand by and watch someone be treated unfairly. And now I'm asking this manager and anyone watching to think about how they treat people, especially people who already face challenges in their daily lives." The reporter nodded, her eyes gleaming with the promise of a headline-worthy story. "And what message would you like to send to the viewers at home?" Shaq crossed his arms, his towering presence making the microphone seem comically small. "It's simple," he said. "Treat people with kindness. It costs nothing, but it means everything." The reporter turned her attention to James. "Sir, would you like to share your side of the story?" James hesitated, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. For a moment, he thought about shaking his head and walking away, but something about Shaq's unwavering confidence gave him courage. "I just came here to buy groceries," James began, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't expect to be singled out or made to feel like I didn't belong. But I'm grateful that someone stood up for me." The crowd clapped again, louder this time, as James felt a flicker of pride beneath his lingering embarrassment. Rick, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to disappear. The reporter turned back to Shaq. "Any final thoughts?" Shaq smiled faintly. "Yeah, we all have a platform, no matter how big or small. Use it to lift people up, not tear them down." The camera crew panned to capture the reactions of the crowd. The tension in the air was still palpable, but it had shifted into something else, hope, perhaps, or a newfound sense of accountability. As the reporter wrapped up her segment, Shaq placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "You good, man?" James nodded, a small smile breaking through his usual stoicism. "Yeah, thanks. The fallout from the incident at Wilson's Market was immediate. By the time Shaq and James left the store, the video captured by an onlooker had already gone viral. Social media exploded with hashtags like Shaq Justice and James deserves respect. Comments poured in from every corner of the internet, ranging from outrage over Rick's behavior to admiration for Shaq's intervention. James sat in his modest living room later that evening, staring at his phone as notifications rolled in. Messages of support filled his inbox, many from strangers. But despite the overwhelming encouragement, he couldn't shake the unease in his chest. He never wanted to be a symbol, just a man trying to live his life with dignity. The knock at his door startled him. Setting his phone aside, James hobbled to the door, crutch under his arm. When he opened it, Shaq's towering frame filled the doorway, his familiar, easy smile immediately putting James at ease. "Hey man," Shaq said, holding up a takeout bag. "Thought you might need some company. Brought dinner." James blinked in surprise. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Shaq replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "But I wanted to. Plus I figured you could use a friend right now." They settled into James's small kitchen, the smell of fried chicken and biscuits filling the air. As they ate, Shaq leaned back in his chair, his expression serious for the first time that night. "You okay?" he asked. James shrugged. "I guess. I mean, I appreciate what you did back there, but I didn't want all this attention. Now it feels like my life's on display." Shaq nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. The spotlight isn't for everyone. But sometimes things happen for a reason. That video, it's making people think. It's making them talk. And maybe, just maybe, it'll change how someone treats the next person they meet." James considered this, the weight of Shaq's words settling over him. "I just didn't think anyone would care. Most of the time, people like me, we're invisible." "Not anymore," Shaq said firmly. "You've got a voice now, James. Use it." The next morning, James woke to a flurry of activity outside his window. Reporters lined the sidewalk, their cameras trained on his house. Sighing, he closed the blinds and turned on the news. There was his face on the screen, alongside Shaq's towering figure. The clip from the store played again, followed by a montage of reactions from the public. Some were supportive, praising Shaq and condemning Rick's actions. Others questioned the media frenzy, asking why one man's story was garnering so much attention when countless others went unheard. As James watched, his phone buzzed with a call. It was Shaq. "Hey," Shaq said when James answered. "You see the news?" "Hard to miss it," James replied. "Good," Shaq said. "'Cause I just got off the phone with the station. They want to do a sit-down interview with both of us. What do you think?" James hesitated. The idea of sharing his story on live television was daunting. But then he thought about the countless others who had been humiliated, overlooked, or dismissed. Maybe this wasn't just about him anymore. "I'll do it," he said finally. "But only if we talk about more than just what happened to me. This needs to be bigger than that." Shaq's laugh was warm and approving. "That's what I like to hear. I'll set it up." The interview aired 2 days later, drawing millions of viewers. James, seated next to Shaq in the studio, spoke candidly about his experiences as a disabled man in a world that often saw him as less than. Shaq, ever the charismatic giant, emphasized the importance of kindness, respect, and standing up for what's right. By the end of the segment, the host was visibly moved. "James, what do you hope people take away from this?" James thought for a moment before answering. That everyone deserves dignity. No matter who you are, no matter what you're going through, you matter. And it's time we start treating each other that way. The studio erupted in applause, but James hardly noticed. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen not just by the cameras, but by the world. 2 days after the television interview, Maplewood buzzed with activity. Wilson's Market was unrecognizable as the small, sleepy grocery store that once prided itself on its cozy atmosphere. The parking lot was crowded not with customers, but with protesters holding signs that read "Respect all people and disability is not a crime." Others chanted slogans demanding Rick's resignation as store manager. Inside, Rick sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen. His inbox was flooded with emails, most of them scathing messages condemning his actions. The store's social media page had been bombarded with negative reviews and calls for accountability. Rick ran a hand through his thinning hair, his mind racing. He had never imagined that his offhand comments would lead to this, a public outcry, the involvement of a celebrity, and now the threat of losing his job. But somewhere deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about one moment. It was about the kind of person he had become. In the break room, the store staff huddled together, whispering about the incident. Most of them agreed that Rick had crossed a line. A cashier named Elena, who had worked at Wilson's for 5 years, spoke up. I always thought Rick was strict, but this was different. He made that man feel like he didn't belong, she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Another employee nodded. And he never apologized. That says a lot. As the tension within the store mounted, James Carter sat at home, trying to process the whirlwind of events that had turned his quiet life upside down. The interview had brought him a flood of attention, some good, some overwhelming. Strangers sent him messages of support, sharing their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. For the first time, James realized that his voice mattered, that his story was part of something larger. But with the attention came criticism too. A handful of people accused him of seeking fame or blowing the incident out of proportion. James tried not to let their words sting, but it wasn't easy. He reminded himself of what Shaq had said during their conversation: "You've got a voice now. Use it." Shaq, true to his word, stayed in touch. That afternoon he called James to check in. "Hey man," Shaq's familiar baritone rumbled through the phone. "How you holding up?" James hesitated before answering. "Honestly, it's been a lot. I'm grateful for the support, but it's hard being in the spotlight. I didn't ask for this." "I hear you," Shaq said. "But think about the people you're helping. That interview? It's making people think, James. That's how change starts." James exhaled slowly, letting the words sink in. "I just hope it lasts. I don't want this to be one of those stories people forget about in a week." Shaq chuckled. "Trust me, man. This is bigger than a week. It's bigger than you or me. You started something important." Meanwhile, back at Wilson's Market, the store owner, Mr. Harrison, had finally had enough. After receiving countless calls and emails from customers, he decided to confront Rick directly. "Rick," Mr. Harrison said, stepping into the cramped office, "we need to talk." Rick looked up, his face pale. "Look, I know I messed up, but—" "No buts," Mr. Harrison interrupted. "What you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure to uphold the values this store stands for. I can't ignore that." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but the stern look on Mr. Harrison's face silenced him. "I've made my decision," Mr. Harrison continued. "Effective immediately, you're no longer the manager of this store. I'm giving you the option to resign or be terminated." The words hit Rick like a punch to the gut. For a moment he considered pleading his case, but he knew it was pointless. He had brought this on himself. "I'll resign," he muttered, his voice barely audible. As Rick packed up his belongings, a mix of shame and regret settled over him. He realized that his actions hadn't just hurt James, they had hurt the entire community. And for the first time, he began to wonder if he could ever make amends. Outside, the protests quieted as news of Rick's resignation spread. A sense of victory rippled through the crowd, but for many it was just the beginning. They knew that one man stepping down wouldn't solve the deeper issues at play. That evening, James received a message from Elena, the cashier at Wilson's Market. She invited him to speak at a community meeting being held at the local library. "People want to hear from you," she wrote. "Your story is making a difference." James hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The thought of standing in front of a crowd was daunting, but he knew this was an opportunity to turn his experience into something meaningful. "Count me in," he replied. The community meeting at the Maplewood Library was unlike anything James had ever experienced. The room buzzed with energy, a mix of familiar faces and strangers eager to hear his story. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, with people lining up along the walls when the seats ran out. At the front of the room stood a simple podium with a microphone, flanked by banners that read "Dignity for All" and "Voices of Change." James stood off to the side, gripping his crutches tightly as Shaq leaned down to whisper to him. "You got this, man," Shaq said, his voice low and encouraging. "Just speak from the heart. People are here because they believe in you." James nodded, his throat dry, despite his best efforts to stay calm. He had never been a public speaker, and the weight of the crowd's expectations made his nerves flare. Still, he couldn't ignore the undeniable sense of purpose that had grown in him since the incident at Wilson's Market. The organizer, a young woman named Maya, stepped up to the microphone and addressed the audience. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This meeting isn't just about one event, it's about creating a stronger, more inclusive community. and tonight we're honored to hear from someone whose courage has inspired us all. Please welcome James Carter. The room erupted in applause as James made his way to the podium, his crutches clicking softly against the polished wood floor. He paused, steadying himself before looking out at the sea of faces. The sight was overwhelming but also deeply humbling. "Hi everyone," he began, his voice shaky but gaining strength. "I'm not used to speaking in front of so many people, so bear with me." The crowd chuckled warmly, easing his tension. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. It means a lot, not just to me, but to everyone who's ever felt invisible or unwelcome." James took a deep breath and continued. What happened at Wilson's Market wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much bigger. For years I've learned to brush off the looks, the comments, the assumptions, but deep down it wears on you. It makes you question your worth. He paused, his voice catching. But when Shaq stood up for me that day, it was like a light switched on. I realized that I don't have to accept being treated as less than. None of us do. We all deserve dignity, respect, and the chance to live our lives without fear of judgment. The crowd erupted in applause again, but James wasn't done. He gripped the edges of the podium, his voice steady now. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us, about how we see each other and how we treat each other. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when we come together, when we decide enough is enough." As he spoke, James noticed nods of agreement throughout the audience. He spotted Alina, the cashier from Wilson's Market, wiping away a tear. Even Shaq looked moved, his large frame leaning forward intently. When James finished, the applause was thunderous. People stood, clapping and cheering as he stepped away from the podium. Shaq clapped him on the shoulder, beaming with pride. Afterward, the meeting turned into a forum where others shared their own experiences. An older woman spoke about being overlooked because of her age, while a young man described struggling to find acceptance as a member of the LGBTQ community. Each story added depth to the discussion, highlighting the ways prejudice and bias affected lives in ways both subtle and overt. Elena stood up and addressed the crowd. "I've worked at Wilson's Market for years, and I've seen people like James come in, everyday people just trying to live their lives. We have to do better, not just as individuals, but as a community. It's time we hold each other accountable for the way we treat one another." The crowd responded with murmurs of agreement, and someone shouted, "Hear, hear." James felt a swell of pride as he realized how many people were taking this moment to heart. At the end of the evening, Maya approached James and Shaq as the crowd began to disperse. "That was incredible," she said. "We're planning more meetings like this, and I'd love for you to be involved. We need voices like yours." James hesitated, but Shaq nudged him playfully. "Told you, man. You're a leader now." James smiled, still adjusting to the idea. If it means helping others feel seen and heard, I'm in. As he walked home that night, James felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. The events of the past week had turned his life upside down, but they had also given him a new purpose. For the first time, he felt not just like a man with a disability, but like someone who could make a difference. The sun rose over Maplewood the morning after the community meeting, casting a warm light over the quiet town. For James Carter, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for himself, but for the community that had rallied around his story. The meeting had ignited something powerful, a collective desire to make their town a better, more inclusive place. As James sipped his morning coffee, his phone buzzed with notifications. Messages of support continued to pour in, but what caught his attention were updates from Maya and the group organizing the meetings. They were already planning the next event, focusing on actionable steps to combat discrimination and create a more welcoming environment for everyone in Maplewood. James smiled. For the first time, he felt like his voice wasn't just being heard, it was making an impact. At Wilson's Market, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. With Rick gone, Mr. Harrison had stepped in to oversee daily operations while searching for a new manager. The changes were immediate. Employees were encouraged to share their ideas, and a new customer service training program was implemented, emphasizing respect and inclusivity. Elena, the cashier, noticed the difference right away. "It's like a weight's been lifted," she remarked to a coworker as she stocked shelves. "People seem happier, like they actually want to be here." Shoppers noticed too. An elderly woman stopped James as he made his way through the produce section later that week. "I saw you on the news," she said, her voice kind but firm. You've done something good here, young man. Thank you. James nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. Thank you for saying that, he replied. But it's not just me, it's all of us working together. The following weekend, James found himself in an unlikely place, a local gymnasium packed with students, parents, and teachers for a youth basketball tournament. Shaq had invited him to speak to the kids about resilience and the importance of treating others with kindness. The gym buzzed with energy as Shaq introduced James to the crowd. This guy Shaq began, his voice booming, is one of the toughest, most inspiring people I've ever met. And he's here to share some wisdom with all of you. James approached the microphone, the chatter dying down as the kids turned their attention to him. He took a deep breath, scanning the crowd of eager young faces. Hey everyone, he began, his tone light. I'm not a basketball legend like Shaq, but I do know a thing or two about what it means to keep pushing forward, even when life throws you a curveball. He shared a brief version of his story, focusing on the lessons he'd learned about resilience, self-worth, and the power of community. You're never too small to make a difference, he said. And it doesn't take a celebrity to stand up for what's right. It starts with the little things, how you treat your classmates, how you speak to people who might be different from you. Those small actions add up. The crowd erupted in applause as James stepped away from the microphone. A few kids ran up to him afterward, asking for advice or simply thanking him for sharing his story. One boy who walked with a limp looked up at James with wide eyes. I get picked on sometimes, he admitted quietly, but you make me feel like I can stand up for myself. James crouched down, resting on his crutches. You can, he said, his voice steady, and you don't have to do it alone. There are always people who will stand with you, just like I had Shaq. The boy smiled, his confidence bolstered by James's words. Later that evening, James and Shaq sat in a quiet diner, sharing a meal and reflecting on everything that had happened. The week had been a whirlwind, but it had also been transformative. You know, James said, pushing his plate aside, I never thought any of this would happen. I didn't think my story mattered. Shaq smiled, his massive hand resting on the table. James, your story matters more than you know. Look at all the people you've inspired. Look at what's happening in this town. That's because of you. James shook his head modestly. It's because of all of us, everyone who decided they were tired of looking the other way. Shaq chuckled. All right, I'll give you that. But you're still the spark that lit the fire. The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of the diner's neon sign filling the space. For James, it was a moment of peace, a rare but welcome feeling after years of struggle. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in Maplewood continued. The community meetings grew in size and scope, tackling issues beyond disability discrimination. The town became a model of what could happen when people came together to create change. For James, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but he was no longer the invisible man he had once been. He had found his voice in a community that stood behind him. And while the spotlight eventually moved on, James knew that the impact of what had happened would linger. It wasn't just about one moment in a grocery store. It was about what came after: the connections, the conversations, and the belief that a single act of kindness could ripple outward and change the world. Sometimes, it takes a moment of injustice to remind us of the power we hold to make things right. And when we stand together, even the smallest voices can echo far and wide.